Hello bookworms! Today I'm going to be sharing my February wrap-up with you. I'm a little bit behind. I had a lot of things going on in my personal life. I know that I shared on both Instagram and in the community tab on YouTube, but I lost my mom in February and I've been behind obviously ever since because yeah, I think that's pretty reasonable. But anyway, today I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in February, catching you guys up on what it is that I've read. So in February, I ended up reading a total of 9 books. I thought that I was going to read a little bit more, but obviously didn't. I thought I was going to read a little bit more. I did read about half of another book, but I'll get into that toward the end of the video. So I'm going to do the same thing that I did in January where I rank the books in order from least favorite to most favorite. It doesn't necessarily mean that the books were at the bottom of the list were terrible, but it does mean that they were the ones that I enjoyed less than the ones that are going to be at the top of the list. So the first book that I listened to on audiobook was Shit Actually by Lindy West. This was a collection of essays that were critiquing different popular films from, I'm trying to actually remember what the earliest one was, but definitely from like the 80s to present-ish time. This was fine. It was not one of my favorite things that I've ever listened to. I thought that there were parts that were funny and there were some chapters that I really enjoyed, like the chapter discussing Twilight I found really funny. That was probably my favorite chapter within the whole book. But there were also several films that she discussed that I personally haven't seen, so those chapters obviously didn't appeal to me as much because I hadn't seen the source material, so I wasn't really getting the same thing out of it that I would have if I would have seen those. I kept kind of toying with the idea of DNFing this book because there would be an essay that I would enjoy and then there would be one where I would be like, well, that didn't really do anything for me, so should I stop reading this? And I ended up continuing because there were some chapters that I wanted to listen to. Like she did critique Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park, which are 2 of my favorite films, so I definitely wanted to hear those chapters. Like I said, the Twilight chapter was very funny. The Harry Potter chapter was also funny. I felt like it was more of a humorous summarization of the plot of these films rather than an actual critique in some places. And then also, so the film that she holds above all other films is The Fugitive, and she would rate every single film 10 out of 10 DVDs of The Fugitive, or, you know, so on and so forth. And I have never seen The Fugitive, so that also made it a little bit difficult for me because I didn't understand like the fundamental that the rating system was based on. Also, I think it's criminal that she watched Terminator 2 without watching the original Terminator. Oh my goodness. So ultimately, this was fine. It was a quick listen, but it wasn't really my cup of tea, and I ended up giving this one 2 stars. Next on the list is The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. I almost said Norseed, which is the main character's name. But I had been so looking forward to this book because the concept is so interesting. I felt like it was a really high concept kind of story, but it ended up being pretty simplistic. So it really just didn't live up to my expectations. And in the book, we're following a character named Nora Seed who is very unhappy with her life and she decides to end her life, so trigger warning for suicide. She ends up in this kind of in-between place called the Midnight Library. While Nora's there, she has the opportunity to explore all of the choices that she didn't make in her life and to see how things would have been different if she would have gone down a different path, which sounds so cool. I went into the book assuming that she was going to learn that the choices that she made were important because they made her into who she was as a person that day, and that is ultimately where we got to. But I thought that there was going to be something like exciting or really thought-provoking or just really meaningful like along her journey to get to that realization, and I just kind of felt like that never really happened. This is a really easy book to read. I read it in I think just over 24 hours. Even though I wasn't super enjoying it, it was very digestible. I can definitely see why this book has mass appeal, but unfortunately it just didn't have the depth that I was looking for. And I just want to make it clear that I didn't dislike the book. I just went in with really high expectations, and I think that that was not the right mindset to go in with. So overall, this is another one that I felt just kind of medium on, and I gave this 3 stars. Next is another nonfiction book, and that is Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. I had been so excited to read this book because when this book was published, it was such like a pivotal moment in our history where people started actually taking concerns about the environment seriously, and there were major changes that were made to a lot of the policies and laws that our government had in place as a result of this book and the research that Rachel Carson shared with everybody. So on that front, I was like, I'm so curious to see like how this book sparked so much change, and after reading it, I totally get it. But I do have really mixed feelings about this one. So like, despite understanding how important this book was, it was really tough for me personally to read because I was just getting major anxiety throughout the entire thing. She focuses a lot on a chemical called DDT that was often used and sprayed around to kill different pesticides, but is also detrimental to humans and children and, you know, cats and dogs and birds and fish and lots of other animals. As I was reading those and kept hearing her talk about like all of the different species that were being affected by DDT being released into the atmosphere, I was just getting really anxious and uncomfortable, especially when Rachel would point out different scenarios that happened on Long Island, which is where I grew up. I had to continuously remind myself how old this book is and how none of those practices were in place when I was even born, but it was still stressful nonetheless. But overall, I am glad that I read it. I do feel like I learned a lot about chemicals and how slowly laws can change, and I also thought it was interesting that Rachel actually wanted this to be published as an article in a magazine, but literally no magazine publishers would publish her piece because they were worried about losing advertisers, which is terrible. So she ended up having it traditionally published. This was like a really big deal for her to publish. It's not something that she really wanted to do. She actually tried to get other people to write this book, but nobody wanted to because it was kind of scary to go against all of these big companies, and those companies did come after her once it was published, and they tried to discredit her in any way that they possibly could. So it was like really brave that this woman did this and shared all of this information and was able to bring attention to the information that she had and be able to get some of our laws changed so that future generations have benefited from not having chemicals released into the air. So yeah, mixed feelings, very interesting, but also very anxiety inducing, and I ended up giving this one 3 stars. Then I read You Have a Match by Emma Lord, and I had been so highly anticipating Emma Lord's sophomore novel. I loved her debut, Tweet Cute, so much. It was one of my favorite books of last year, so obviously I was like just dying for this one to come out. It ended up not living up to my expectations in the sense that Tweet Cute is still like by far my favorite of her 2 books, but I still did really enjoy it. I think Emma has a knack for writing authentic dialogue, and I think that she really excels at character development, and I'm a character-driven reader, so obviously that works pretty well for me. But in this book, we are following a girl named Abby who takes a DNA test and finds out that she has a secret sister. Her and Savannah, who's her sister, don't live too far from each other, so they end up meeting at a park, and after their one kind of brief encounter, Savannah convinces Abby to go to the summer camp that she's going to be working at so that the sisters can just kind of get to know one another. And it's there that they learn just how different they really are from each other. Abby's more of a kind of rebellious type, and she kind of skirts around any uncomfortable issues, whereas Savannah is very direct, very motivated, very goal-oriented, and the pair just kind of clash. There's also a bunch of romance in the book. I really like Abby's love interest, Leo. I think that they are super cute. That is like a friends to lovers romance, which is really nice to just see that bloom. And I think that the book did a really good job of staying light and fun, but still dissecting a pretty heavy topic. There was so much emotion when everything kind of came to a head toward the end of the book, and it was really exciting. I couldn't put it down, and I really enjoyed it, and I'm very much looking forward to reading Emma Lord's next book, whatever that may be. I will definitely be picking it up, and I ended up giving this one 3.5 stars. Next on the list is The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. This is one of the first more literary books that I read this year, and it did not disappoint. I really enjoyed this book. This was a fascinating character study following a set of white passing twins, and it really explored race and race identity, and it was a multi-generational story, so we got to see how race impacted 3 generations of Vignez women. When we start off, we are following the twins Stella and Desiree, who live in a small town called Mallard, where everyone who lives there is Black, but is like closer to being white passing, and it's very valued for people to have lighter skin. And the twins are super, super light, and different circumstances lead to their mother pulling them out of school so that they can work because the family needs money and they want to better themselves and their lives. So the twins end up running away from home and they go to New Orleans together, and they both go down like wildly different life paths. Stella ends up getting a job in a department store, and everybody thinks that she is white and she just doesn't correct them, and then she ends up marrying a white man and he doesn't even know the truth about her heritage. And then on the other hand, we have Desiree, and Desiree gets involved with like the darkest man that she can find, and she has a child that is much darker. But when Jade's father starts beating Desiree, she ends up leaving and takes Jade with her back to Mallard, back to her mother. And meanwhile, Stella is living like this completely different life in California. It was very character driven, which I really enjoyed. So just found all of these women fascinating, and just the different choices that they made and where they ended up, but despite having a similar upbringing. And I also really liked how the stories intersected and how the daughters of the twins end up in each other's orbit. The whole thing overall was just like so interesting, and I feel like I was just constantly thinking about it, and I'm still wondering what's going on with these characters today, which I think is just the mark of a great book. And I ended up giving this one 4 stars. Next is another audiobook that I listened to, and that is Hood Feminism by Mikki Kendall. This is a nonfiction book, and it focuses on how there are many women that are often left out of the mainstream feminism movement. Mikki argues that meeting someone's basic needs should be like the fundamental feminist issue, but it's often not, and many times underprivileged and colored women are ignored in the discussion of feminism, and also trans women. And it also focuses on how mainstream feminism usually focuses on increasing privilege for women who are often already privileged. The book talks about how things like food security and housing and gun violence should be like the basic topics that we're thinking about and talking about. I thought it was a really thought-provoking read. I think that Mikki did an incredible amount of research. She had so many facts and figures to back up all of her opinions throughout the book. There were some small anecdotes that were added in, but I did feel like it was very figure heavy. And it actually took me a little bit longer than I expected to read it because of how statistic heavy it was. But I liked that I read it at a slower pace because I felt like I was able to kind of absorb what she was saying a little bit more and to have more time to sit with the different points and think about it. I think if you're interested in reading this one, it's a really good idea to listen to a chapter and then take a break and like sit with your thoughts and really digest what it was that she said before moving on to the next chapter, because there were so many topics that were covered and it can be easy to kind of forget what happened in a previous chapter if you haven't already like reflected on what it was that you just read. So I'm really glad that I listened to this one. I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. And then yet another audiobook listen and a nonfiction book. I listened to Stamped by Jason Reynolds and Ibram X. Kendi. This is another anti-racist read, and this one is a remix of Ibram X. Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning. Jason Reynolds basically adapted that book and made it more digestible for teenagers. And I started with this one because it was available at my library, but a couple chapters in, I immediately put Stamped from the Beginning on hold because I thought that the book was so interesting, and I am so excited to do like a deeper dive and learn even more. This book painted a completely different picture of history than I learned in high school. The book really details like the first racist ideas and how those ideas shaped America. It does touch upon a little bit of European history, but it's definitely an America-centric book. So if you're looking for something that's going to be a little bit more global, this wouldn't be the one to read, but I think that it's definitely worth reading nonetheless. I'm actually curious if Stamped from the Beginning will have some more information about outside of the United States, but I guess I'll see. Hopefully next month, because it still hasn't come off hold yet. I obviously haven't read the original book, but I do think that Jason Reynolds adapted this in such a great way, and he really made it interesting. And I think that it's something that a lot of of teenagers would find really interesting. And he constantly says throughout it, like, this is not a history book, even though it kind of is a history book, but it's history in an interesting and accessible way, which is really important. And I truly think that this should be required reading in schools. But yeah, I loved it. I gave this 5 stars. Then I have yet another nonfiction book, and that is Working on a Song by Anais Mitchell. I loved this book so much. I've been listening to the Hadestown soundtrack pretty often over the past year, ever since I saw it. I got to see Hadestown right before we went into quarantine. We went for Andrew's birthday in January of 2020, end of January, and I'm so thankful that I got to see it, but I've been listening to it ever since, and like, it still makes me cry when I listen to it. It's just so beautiful and so amazing. In case you are not familiar with Hadestown, it is a Broadway musical that is based in Greek mythology. So it follows 2 main storylines, though we do get some other people in there too, but our main characters are Hades and Persephone and Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus and Eurydice are really like the main characters. Hearing her detail the process behind writing all of the songs in Hadestown and their evolution over time from the original recording until the show got on Broadway was fascinating. I couldn't believe all of the changes that were made, and she had such thoughtful reasons for making those changes. I actually forgot that I loved it so much that I bought a copy, so I should have been holding this up this whole time. I was also really glad to get a physical copy because there are some photos in here, which obviously I couldn't see while I was reading the audiobook. But I really loved hearing about the earlier drafts of lyrics. It was really cool to hear how some things were originally told, and then to also hear the anecdotes that went along with those changes and the different contributions that were made from the cast and just Anais's writing process as a whole. The show is perfect for anyone who loves Broadway musicals or anyone who loves Greek mythology, and this book was just incredible. If you've already seen the show, this is such an amazing supplement, and if you haven't, I highly recommend just listening to the soundtrack and then picking up the book, because it's like a full musical, so you won't miss any dialogue by not seeing the show performed. Obviously, the show is pretty incredible when it's performed because the choreography is really great and the atmosphere and just everything about it, but you will get the full story if you do just listen to it. And then I would definitely recommend this, and I gave this 5 stars. This book was so good. And then my absolute favorite book of the month was Chain of Iron by Cassandra Clare, and I did a little bit of a reading vlog. It was like a Pokemon / Chain of Iron reading vlog, and every single time that I talked about Chain of Iron, I called it Chain of Gold, and I don't know why I did that. I finally got it right toward the end of the video when I was talking about the end, but I digress. So this is easily my favorite fiction book that I've read so far this year. I can't say I'm surprised. I'd been so highly anticipating this one. I just love these characters so much, to the depths of my soul. They just mean so much to me. I honestly would have loved if this book was an additional 1,000 pages, because I never wanted my time with them to end. I think one of the main reasons that I love it so much is the friendships in this series are just so good, and they're so well written and so believable. It's kind of why I love the Raven Boys series so much. It's really the friendship in that series that cemented it for me, and that's just exactly how I feel about The Last Hours too. I obviously haven't read the last book in the trilogy yet, but I would be surprised if this didn't end up being my favorite Shadowhunter series. I think this one really cemented it for me. I think it was just the perfect blend of really cute, fun character moments, but then really intense and stressful scenes too. Like I said in my vlog, but there were so many times that something was happening and I was like, this is adorable. But then I would also immediately feel so stressed out because I would be like, I feel like Cassandra Clare is just giving me these scenes because she's gonna rip it all out from under me by the time that we get to the end. Every time that I was happy, I was also very nervous, and it made for a really fun reading experience. There was also a part in the beginning for James's bachelor party that I still will like randomly remember and just laugh about. It was so funny. That was probably one of my favorite things in the whole book, but I loved it. This is a pretty obvious 5 stars, and I cannot wait to see what's going to happen in the next book, and I cannot wait to reread this book. And then last but certainly not least is A Court of Silver Flames by Sarah J. Maas. And this book I haven't finished. I've just started it, so I'm about 250 pages into it. Unfortunately, I'm having a really tough time reading it, and it is 100% me and 100% not the book. When I started reading it, I was so invested, and there are so many elements in it that I really enjoy. Despite Nesta being not the most heartwarming character, I am really enjoying her story. It's just that, so this was the book that I was reading when I was at my parents' house, and I was reading it in the morning, and it was my mom's last day, so it was just really tough, and I feel like every time that I pick it up, I'm just like getting flashbacks to that really tough day. So it's definitely not been easy for me to pick this one up, and it's difficult because Sarah J. Maas is one of my favorite authors, and I'm obviously so excited about this book and to have a continuation of the series. And I do feel invested in what's going on, and I feel invested in the characters, and I really do want to finish it, but it's just like every time that I pick it up, I just keep going back to that day, and it's like really hard for me. So I'm not like DNFing it. I am reading other books as well, and I'm gonna kind of slowly read this one. I hope that I will get to a point where it'll just like action will pick up and it'll just grip me, and then I'll be in it and be able to finish it. But I feel like if I DNF it, then I will never pick it back up because of the memories, and I don't want that to happen. So this has been a struggle. So those are all of the books and part of a book that I read in February. Let me know if you guys read anything that I mentioned. I feel like I had a kind of eclectic reading month for myself. I'm definitely having an interesting reading month in March too, so that's gonna be really fun to wrap up next month. That's all that I have for this video, and I will see you guys soon in a new one. Bye!